Very good. Then the witness is yours, Mr. Freilich.
Thank you, Your Honor. Could you please state your name for the record?
Diane Lytton, Lytton.
What is your occupation?
I'm an independent forensic psychologist.
Are you licensed in the state of Wisconsin?
Yes.
Are you licensed anywhere else?
No.
Can you briefly provide your educational background?
Yes. I have a doctoral degree in psychology, and I was initially a research scientist at UW-Madison, and then later completed 3,000 hours of postdoctoral training at Mendota Mental Health Institute, and then became a clinical psychologist in the state.
Can you
Since 1997, I was hired then at Mendota Mental Health Institute, and left there in 1997 and became an independent forensic psychologist.
Where did you go to college?
UW-Madison. Well, my PhD is from UW-Madison, and I have a master's degree in psychology from the University of Georgia, and my bachelor's degree in psychology was at a small college in southern Georgia, and also in psychology.
Was that at Albany State College in Georgia?
Yes, it's a historic HBCU college.
Could you briefly provide the court with any memberships that you're involved in or associations?
Yes, I'm currently a member of the Wisconsin Psychological Association, former board member, and I'm also a member of an international science organization, ISBA, International Society for Bayesian Analysis, and members of 2 subgroups of that organization.
Are you also a member of the American Psychological Association?
Not right currently. I'm sorry I didn't take that off my resume, but not currently.
You were in the past?
Yeah, I was in the past.
Okay. Now, moving on, could you briefly describe your professional experience?
Yes, beginning at when I was doing my 3,000 hours postdoctoral training at Mendota Mental Health, I worked a year on the adolescent male forensic unit, then worked for several years and was hired as a psychologist on the former civil unit at Mendota. And due to budget cuts, I became a forensic psychologist on the forensic units at Mendota, and was spent 2.5 years on the what's called now the management treatment unit at Mendota, Goodland Hall, where we received overflow competency evaluations needed when the admission unit at Mendota was too full. And also we housed on my unit, we housed the 14 most aggressive male forensic patients in the state. And somewhere there, again, a subset were there for competency evaluations. I completed 42 competency evaluations, but the majority of the patients on my unit were NGI, committed, legal insanity.
Have you done any teaching or acted as an instructor in the field of psychology?
Yes, I worked a couple years as an adjunct faculty at the Madison Area Technical College and taught psychology courses, and then a couple more years at Edgewood College in Madison. Also taught Introduction to Psychology. And I forgot to mention that since being a forensic psychologist independent, since 1997, I've conducted many hundreds of evaluations of persons for competency, NGI, sentencing dispositions. I do guardianships for Outagamie County, many hundreds.
Have you been involved also as a research scientist?
Yes, I continue to do research, I call it my fun hobby on the side, I don't get paid for it, for now 19 years, concerning controversies in the legal system. The overall goal is to advance science in the legal and mental health fields, as you'll see on my CV, regarding kind of boiling it down, how to make decision-making, evidence-based decisions in the legal and mental health fields. The science has not progressed in those fields nearly as much as in what's called the natural sciences, physics, whatnot. I do interdisciplinary research, combining history and different fields to help resolve controversies in my field.
Have you written any publications or been involved in any presentations that you have been involved in?
Yes, I think about 11, and I have other publications earlier in my career, a variety of them, but I believe I have about 11 publications or presentations in this field, and I, excuse me, have long worked with another forensic psychologist who's now retired, but we've been working on the same issues for, I think, 19 years now.
What kind of publications have you written?
Prior to this 19 years in this, working on this controversies to advance science in the legal mental health, I did a variety of different, earlier, during my PhD, I have a number of publications in the psychology, basic psychology field, cognitive psychology field, memory, learning, how people develop. And then as a more of an interdisciplinary scientist at UW-Madison in the medical school, I conducted different interdisciplinary projects on different, you can see on my CV, different fields within the family medicine, published some and presented.
Dr. Litton, have you prepared a curriculum vitae or a resume?
Yeah, I wrote a brief one.
Okay.
More thing?
Well, let me just ask another question. Your curriculum vitae has a sticker on it, an exhibit sticker, number 1. Your curriculum vitae is several pages, correct?
Yes.
If I indicated to you that it's 5 pages, would that be accurate?
That's about right.
And your curriculum vitae contains all of the information that you just testified to, correct?
Yeah.
Even your address, your education, educational background, memberships, professional experience, and publications. Is that fair?
Yes.
I would offer Exhibit 1.
Any objection?
No.
1 is received.
You were going to say something additional?
Well, when you asked me about teaching, I kind of forgot. One aspect of my last 19 years of doing my current research and numerous presentations, some of those presentations were done to groups of attorneys to teach them how to make evidence-informed decisions in the field, in the legal field. So I've done a number of those types of presentations to both defense attorneys and others.
Okay, thank you. With regards to this case, Did you have the occasion to meet with Taylor Denise Schabusiness?
Yes.
How did that come about?
I originally was asked to be involved in the case by her former attorney, Quinn Jolly, to examine her, evaluate her for both competency and NGI, not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. And then when he left the case and you assumed the case, then I agreed to work continue on the case for you.
Did you initially have contact with Taylor Denise Schabusiness in February of 2023?
Yes.
Could you describe the contact that you had with her at that time? Do you know the specific date?
I'd have to look on my report if that's okay.
Sure. Refresh your memory.
Sure. I met with her for 3 attempted interviews. The first 2 were in February 7, 2023, and then another attempted interview February 13, 2023. And she refused to talk with me on all 3 occasions, despite after the first 2 attempted interviews, her attorney, Mr. Jolly, met with her. She had thrown a chair at me during the first attempted interview.
Was that on February 7th of 2023?
Yes.
Okay, what happened there?
This was done in a private conference room at the jail. And she was nonverbal. She was nonverbal during all 3 of these attempted interviews back in February 2023. But the first time she entered the room, didn't greet me, seemed to, she acknowledged I was there, and sat down. We both sat down. And I went through, even though she was nonverbal, wasn't talking to me, she would nod her head. So I went through my consent form with her, explaining the reason for my evaluation, her rights to confidentiality, and so on. And she again nodded that she understood. Then when I started the interview, by my usual asking her date of birth, her race, she then suddenly got up from her chair and yelled and went to the corner of the room, picked up fortunately it was a plastic chair, and then she threw it at me across the room. It did not hit me. She then calmly sat back down, and I rang for the guards, and it took them a couple minutes to get there. Meanwhile, I sat back down too, and then asked her about why she had done that. I did notice her physiological response was bizarre, which she didn't have any. After just doing that, being extremely angry, throwing a chair at her evaluator, her defense retained evaluator, she sat there very, no response, just blank face, no physiological response of a person who had just done such a thing. The guards then came in and they agreed that I should terminate the interview. But then as we spoke more with the guards, they suggested, well, I could meet with her in the secured attorney's booth, we call it. So I asked her if she would be willing to talk to me if we moved to the secure booth. And I had to ask her a couple times, but then she agreed, again, nodding. So then I moved to the secure booth. And when she came in, she again remained nonverbal, despite 10 minutes before saying she would talk to me. I did some goofy Dr. Litton stuff with her to try to disarm her, to engage her, and she just remained nonverbal, and we finally terminated the interview. Then Mr. Jolly met with her twice to ask why did she throw a chair at me. She couldn't really say, but then he met with her twice over 2 days to verify she'd be willing to talk with me. So I returned on February 13, 2023, and at that time, the guard asked my name. The guard went back to her Miss Schabusiness's cell, and she refused to talk to me again.
You said there were 3 times that you had contact with her, February 7th, February 13th. What was the other date?
The other one was when you had taken over the case, and then she again agreed to talk with me, and that was, I interviewed her then for several hours with you in the room, I think it was June 19, 2023.
And tell me about that interview on June 19th of 2023.
I had asked that you be present to encourage her. She had, at that point, she had a good relationship with you. Similarly, she had earlier had a good relationship with Mr. Jolly, who she knew from a prior family connection, which of course changed when several days after my attempted interviews with her in February 2023, that's when she attacked Mr. Jolly in the courtroom, and he left the case. So when I interviewed her with you present, my conclusion from observing her reactions to my questions, what she offered during the interview, led me to conclude that, yes, she met the criteria for consideration of the special plea, not guilty, NGI, I call it. But then I also concluded at that time she was not competent to proceed to trial.
Can you tell me what was the foundation for that conclusion or opinion that you had?
The foundation included her looking in detail at her extensive records going back to childhood, looking at the pattern of her behaviors that began in middle school and escalated in high school, review of her Nicolay inpatient records, psychiatric records, that I think were from 2021, and looking at those records, her jail records, and then just the manner in which she has presented to other evaluators in this case and a previous evaluation she had for custody of her son. And then the observations that I made during the interview with her when you were present showed signs of an active psychotic disorder. They included some most predominant things were that other evaluators in this case had also observed too. Her, what we call tangential thought disorder, where she would derail and bring up totally unrelated subjects and really bizarre statements. She had difficulty paying attention and concentrating during that 2-hour interview. When I looked at my notes from that interview, and I compared them to Dr. Tracy Lucetta's earlier 2022 competency evaluation, Ms. Schabusiness, in my interview with her, very similar type of responses that she gave both to me and previously during Dr. Lucetta's evaluation for competency, but also other competency and NGI evaluators in this case thought what we disorganization. Her very striking in this case. This is a very unusual case. Her manner in which she presents herself, and that includes not only what she says to people, including jail staff, their mental health people, back when she was at inpatient for 21 days at Nicolay for psychiatric treatment. And then with the evaluators in this case, she has a very unusual, psychologists call it affect, the emotional expressions that are on her face don't match what she's talking about. Again, other evaluators have noticed her tendencies to go off track and not always coherent. And we call it thought disorganization, and I noticed that quite prominently during the 2 hours I spent with her. I also interviewed Mr. Jolly over his time on the case. He had met with her weekly meetings with her during his months on the case, other than for a couple months when he was unable to meet with her because she was in seclusion at the jail. And then I also interviewed you. With Mr. Jolly, as the time continued with him on her case, sometimes she seemed coherent and lucid during their conversation, seemed to know what was going on. But then she also would suddenly, and he only interviewed her in the attorney's booth, but sometimes he said that sometimes she would just suddenly stand up and scream. Another time she suddenly hit her head on the what you call that, the thing in there, hit her head. And I asked him, Mr. Jolly, what had they been talking about when she suddenly then got up and screamed or banged her head? And the context of what they've been talking about was not about, like, say, the details of her case events. It was nothing that would have elicited somebody to suddenly get up and scream. He also really, both of you, Mr. Jolly and now you, Mr. Freilich, both of you reported difficulties with her ability to pay attention and concentrate. The major problem, and this is why I raised competency again, is that although she seems to know and remember some basic courtroom, like the people, the judge's role, although that one had a paranoid flavor to it, the judge's role. But she seems to know basics about courtroom procedure, well, not courtroom procedures, but legal stuff, like what's not guilty mean. She has a rudimentary understanding of an NGI plea, although I had to explain it again. I had to explain that in the 2-hour interview. I often had to explain these terms again, but she seems, based on my 2 hours interview with her, your impressions of her, Mr. Jolly's impressions, the other evaluators, she seems to have some understanding, very rudimentary, about different plea options, about roles of different people in the courtroom. However, my opinion about competency rests on that I don't think she lacks insight and judgment and the mental capacity to understand the legal proceedings. That's where my opinion, strong opinion, is that despite her knowing the basics about competency, what a judge does, what a guilty plea is, she still exhibits this fundamental lack of insight and judgment about her cases, about how to act in court, about how to help her defense attorney to understand the proceedings.
Dr. Litton, were you aware that Ms. Schabusiness was the subject of a civil commitment order in 2021?
Yes,
And she was, by order of the court, required to be in a psychiatric facility or hospital for a period of time?
yes, and it also came with an order to treat.
A medication order, is that correct?
That's correct, and that's that's not done every day. Both a Chapter 51 commitment, which I was involved in many of those when I worked at Mendota Mental Health and subsequently, and then to go, so that's a mental health commitment, but then to go a step further and for psychiatrists to get an order to treat, that's another step, and it's not done very often. So that was very telling, a good piece of evidence that in 2021, she had a mental health commitment with an order to treat. The psychiatrist at that time, this was at Nicolay, inpatient, the psychiatrist had considered discharging her to Bay Haven, I believe, for drug abuse treatment, but they didn't do it. They decided not to do that. So, and then she went off, apparently she went off medications when she was released from Nicolay.
Do you know what kind of medications she was on when she was at the Nicolay Psychiatric Center?
I'd have to refer to my report, but the medication they used included an antipsychotic medication. She's been on Seroquel. At one point she was prescribed Abilify. These are, and in jail now, she told us that she was also recently prescribed an antipsychotic medication, but she has a history of not complying with taking that medication.
Was that other medication, do you know if it was olanzapine?
It could have been. I said she's been prescribed olanzapine, Seroquel, Abilify, and Risperdal during her past, apparently going all the way back to when she may have been a teenager, and we're still trying to get those records from Bellin, inpatient child adolescent unit, where she was admitted in 11th grade after she obviously exhibited some psychiatric symptoms. And then even earlier than that, she has an admission apparently when she was in 7th grade, but we don't have those records yet.
Dr. Litton, when you met with her, including on June 19th of 2023, did you have any concerns about her affect, her overall affect?
Yes, and that's a term that psychologists, psychiatrists use. It means the facial expressions and maybe even, motor things. And yes, it was striking. And both going back to my 3 attempted interviews with her in February, and I looked at videos, online videos of her appearances when she comes into court, after she attacked Mr. Jolly in court. I looked at those too, and there's a strikingly odd, and it has been noted by other evaluators in the case, this really strikingly odd facial expression. She sometimes is smiling, and the smiling does not fit whatever they're talking about. Jail staff have noticed that. It can be quite rapid in just a day or two, rapid change. But in our interview with her, the 2 hours, I noticed the same thing, that her facial expressions were not consistent with what we were talking about, just the content of what she was talking about was sometimes, quite often, was quite bizarre. She would sometimes kind of smile. I also noticed, and the word smirky, a smirky appearance on her face. Other evaluators have noticed that, and they called it smirky. I've noticed that too. I didn't notice that a lot in the interview, the 2-hour interview, but it was there. So there's a very, to me, very striking difference in how she appears to people versus her actions.
I'm sorry.
Well, and what's being talked about at the time.
Did Ms. Schabusiness say anything about her mental health, what she thought she suffered from or not suffered from? Did she say anything about any kind of prior discussions that she had with mental health professionals?
She's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder in the past. And sometimes she has announced, I think in the interview with her, the 2-hour interview, I think she said bipolar. Sometimes she seems to agree with that diagnosis. Other times, and she's also said schizophrenia. But then other times in the past, she has then said, I don't think I am.
You looked at the records from the Nicolay Psychiatric Clinic, correct?
Yes.
When she was on a civil commitment, was she getting a shot for medication purposes?
Yeah, she has a long pattern of not being compliant consistently with prescribed medications. So they offered her an injected, longer-lasting medicine. In the interview, the 2-hour interview I was able to do with her, she shared that she had just been put on olanzapine, which is another antipsychotic, 3 days before that interview on June 2023. She agreed to take an antipsychotic medication again. I have asked you to get the more recent jail records, which we don't have yet. But so the psychiatrist at the jail thought it could be useful for her. I do not know if she is still on the medications at this time. I don't know.
Did you assess Ms. Schabusiness's memory? And if you did, what comments do you have about that?
I did that informally. I didn't administer any tests, but her memory for both remote events in her life, her memory for more recent events, did indicate some gaps in her memory and problems with her memory. Sometimes, and this is a little known fact about a person who may be psychotic, well, I evaluated many people who were psychotic. Sometimes when they're in a psychotic episode, they do have memory gaps. So that could explain some of her memory issues. She's had a very predominantly, very startling problems with her memory, her recall of events. Other evaluators have said it could be just all faked, but my observations of her and reading all her records is that she seems to have some genuine memory impairments.
How about any assessments with regards to her speech when you would talk with her?
Yeah, the speech was very strikingly odd again. The content of the speech during the 2-hour interview with her, she would what we call derailed frequently. She'd all of a sudden blurt out something that was totally unrelated to what we were talking about. She thought that she was hearing she seemed, from my judgment, she seemed to be paying attention, attending to both auditory and visual hallucinations. They were, somewhat strange. hallucinations, but she has reported that in the past at the jail, Nicolay. So the speech, when you talk with her, it's not to the point of what we call word salad, which is an unusual aspect of some people with a psychotic disorder where you can't understand them at all. It wasn't to that extreme, and I don't think it ever has been, looking at her records. So it's not word salad, so it's coherent to the listener's point of view, but the content of it was bizarre. She also showed an elevation in the volume of her voice when she spoke about the apparent auditory and visual hallucinations. Over the 2 hours, she got more and more scared, upset. She had a much more difficult time apparently controlling the voices and the visual hallucinations she was experiencing. That I could see on her face that she seemed genuinely upset, scared, just very distracted by what she was seeing and hearing.
At least during the interview that you had with her on June 19th, can you give me any specific information as to what she said that may have been odd, or to kind of back up these hallucinations that you're testifying about?
When I asked her about auditory visual hallucinations, she began to describe hearing a train whistle that got progressively louder during the interview. And it sounded like, it seemed from her point of view, that she was actually seeing a train. At one point, towards the end of the 2 hours, that became so prominent that she was very, very distracted about it. She does have some coping strategies for how to deal with that, like when she's in the courtroom and other times. So she described that. Yeah, sometimes I can repress that and control it. She reported what we call command hallucinations that tell her to do things for herself, attack people, and she said most of the time she can control that. She said at one point that regarding the train, she just, again, a real tangent, she said that Johnny Cash died on the train. I think the most, I know, the most weirdest thing she said at the point where I was assessing her knowledge about how to act in court, since there's obviously been some problems, this became really bizarre because she talked about the incident of exposing herself in court, and she indicated that she did it to get the judge to like her. And then at that point, I asked you, her attorney, to describe courtroom behaviors. And she said, again, I have those statements in my report. I don't know if you want me to look here just a minute here, give me a minute here. This was one of the more, and this is where I concluded that she lacks the insight and judgment and the mental capacity to understand the proceedings. I asked her about, I was going through the plea options with her, and by the way, even though I was doing an NGI evaluation, I assessed competency to proceed to trial in all of my forensic evaluations. If they're just for NGI, I still evaluate the person for competency, doesn't matter. So I was asking her about the plea options. Again, she gave some on-track answers. But when I asked her about what the NGI plea means, she said, titties. And I asked her some follow-up questions about what's appropriate courtroom behaviors, she said, show titties in court to judge. And I'm citing, reading from my page 6 here of my evaluation. She recalled doing that in the courtroom, and she hoped it would help the judge's opinions now. That was one of the most unusual things. I asked her about when she told me about that she had been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, age 11 or 12, treated with Adderall. She thought that if she's angry in court, so this is where I was trying to assess her ability to work with you, Mr. Freilich. She thought if she was angry in future court appearances and she cannot understand what is going on, she can ask Mr. Freilich, who will, quote, tap his toes. I asked her about the attack on Mr. Jolly in the courtroom and what her thoughts were at the time. She said, like carnival atmosphere, madness in head constantly. And there's numerous other references. The weird thing that when I briefly discussed the current legal charges with her, she said that she had a thing with Jeffrey Dahmer about a year ago. And just on and on. There were just numerous of these strange comments about Johnny Cash being on the train. She went further into her tangential thoughts about the train, how loud his whistle was, and how Johnny Cash overdosed, apparently, on a train. And so there were numerous examples of that. Those are some of the most prominent ones.
Were you, as part of your evaluation, did you talk to her about alcohol or drug use or abuse?
Yes.
And can you tell me a little bit about your discussions with her on those topics, and then any opinions that you had about that?
Yeah, let me just find it here. She, in my evaluation, and then regarding previous evaluators, she is fairly consistent about it. And I don't have the exact years written down, but she began to use some drugs after her mother's death when Miss Schabusiness was in 5th grade. I think THC. She has said she's never been a big drinker of alcohol, but then started to use, she used LSD a couple times, I think in high school or shortly thereafter, but then began to use methane or cocaine, powder cocaine, sometime, and I'd have to look through, find the dates or how old she was. She started using powder cocaine sometime, I think, after high school, and then methamphetamine, and along with THC and other drugs, maybe in her early 20s.
Did she indicate to you that she used lots of methamphetamine?
Yes. Sometimes she has said that she, could use it 8, 9 times in a day sometimes. And then I think, I think it was more around 2020, because her husband, she told me that her husband was a meth dealer, currently in prison, and that she started to use methamphetamine a lot around in 2020. And she's had some drug treatment, but then left. She didn't finish drug treatment.
Did she describe how the methamphetamine would make her feel?
Yes, and this is unusual, a little counterintuitive, but she said it made her, that methamphetamine was the only thing that helped her thinking and brought her down enough to be able to think clearly. And interestingly, sometimes in a person with a psychotic mental disorder, sometimes the illegal substance has a paradoxical effect. I've encountered this in a couple other evaluations. I kind of give an example of a person with attention deficit disorder with Adderall, which is the stimulant prescribed to treat ADHD, which she does have, and has been prescribed Adderall in the past. And Adderall is a stimulant, and so you wonder, why would you want somebody who has attention deficit hyperactivity to be more stimulated? It has a paradoxical effect with people who have ADHD, and it actually helps them to be less agitated, less up. Well, similarly, with people with a psychotic mental disorder, sometimes a stimulant drug like methamphetamine can actually, or LSD. I've encountered this in a handful of other cases where the person with a psychotic mental disorder, this is very similar to what Ms. Schabusiness has reported. Sometimes the drug, methamphetamine, can actually help them with their problems with thinking, feeling real hyper, not being able to get things together. Sometimes can help them, and sometimes they use vast quantities of it to help with that. You know, again, it's a form of self-medication, but it can have a paradoxical effect, and that's what she has described to other treaters, that the use of methamphetamine, she didn't want to take antipsychotic prescribed medication, but she has stated that she took the methamphetamine to help with her thinking, and it was the only thing that helped, she said.
Did she tell you that when she took methamphetamine, it made her feel like she was floating in air?
Yes, and she told me that, but then she has told other evaluators that too.
Did you inquire as to whether she was ever diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, and she has been so diagnosed. There again, very confusing, her reports about that. At times she has said that she was unfortunately raised by a pedophile, that she experienced rape by a parent, and then, very oddly, she has negated saying that. I found that in an evaluation done for the Child Protective Services in Texas that was requested when she wanted to keep custody of her baby. Yes, so what was the question again? Ask me again.
Did you find that she did suffer from PTSD?
Yes, and that's been fairly consistent in her inpatient records. Some other evaluators have noticed that or noted it. I asked her point blank about the effect her mother's death had on her, and she reported, a tremendous impact and PTSD. But then also I asked her about just a routine question we ask is about head injuries, physical and sexual abuse, and she reported that her spouse hit her on the head several times at least. She never pursued legal charges. So definitely I would say she has PTSD and still does have PTSD, and has caused her a lot of problems and consternation and fear.
You had a chance to review some of her school records, correct? What can you tell me about your review of those records?
They were strikingly odd, okay? The more I looked at them, the odder the feeling got. It's unusual that we get real detailed school records, but Mr. Jolly had requested those, so I have those records earlier. What I noticed was that from kindergarten through 4th grade, part of 5th grade, she was a very good student. She got good grades. She socialized appropriately with other peers and with teachers. She was well liked and no problems. And then starting in 5th grade, which was the year her mother died, her behaviors became increasingly, oppositional. To me, bizarre. They increased, as I mentioned in my report, these behaviors increased through middle school into high school, and they were strikingly just aberrant, with saying very nasty things to other classmates in the classes, to very distracting to other kids, and she distracted other kids, which could be ADHD. That's a common symptom, very distractible. But then she said some really nasty, cruel things to other kids, and then also to teachers. As she, from 6th grade through 11th grade, when she was expelled, she would say some really nasty things to teachers. And then also her class had a speaker come in from the community. I don't remember the police officer who it was. And she later said that everything he said was terrible and, basically trashed him. She would leave classes, just walk out of the classroom, fall asleep in class, very distracting. She got numerous problems noted. And then finally in 11th grade, she came into a classroom just all of a sudden, and she struck another kid several times. Then she was expelled from the class, from the school, I think in Green Bay. And then she apparently completed high school. But this whole change in her behaviors in 5th grade through 11th grade were very strikingly different, odd. They went, as I say in my report, her behaviors went well beyond just your regular, typical bully. It really struck me, and I began to, when I saw her adult inpatient records, her behaviors at the Brown County Jail, the other evaluations in this case, her earlier cases involving battery and stuff like that, she kind of putting it together, I began to wonder, well, what do we got going here? Did she have some other issues that started, the mental illness that she has now, did that start in 5th, 6th, 7th grade and get progressively worse? I have also, frankly, have considered the possibility of some neurodevelopmental issues. I don't know how much she has been evaluated for that possibility, but I certainly now recommending both, as I did before, and as Dr. Lucetta did, I'm certainly recommending further inpatient assessment and neuropsychological testing, and then referral to a neurologist and possible further evaluation just to rule out that there's something else going on here. Neural development, some kind of organic problems, because things just, the whole picture of her doesn't quite add up.
Were you concerned about whether or not she's got an organic brain injury?
Yes.
Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. It's like we talk, MDs, medical doctors talk about when a person presents, and they're taught this like first week in medical school, when a patient comes to a physician, you look for horses first. In other words, the most common explanation for the patient's symptoms versus zebras, really much less common explanations of a person's behavior. So in Miss Schabusiness's situation, there are some obvious things that would be considered the horses. First, bipolar disorder, which she has been diagnosed with. Dr. Lucetta considered the obvious methamphetamine-induced psychotic disorder, which seems much less likely now that she's been off methamphetamine for over a year. So we look at, okay, bipolar, she's already been diagnosed with bipolar, so some of her symptoms could be that, and her symptoms do seem to fit that. However, as you hate to look at the zebras over here, the less common things, but when I look at her this very weird, odd presentation that she has exhibited with me, with jail staff, back when she was inpatient, as a child, as an adolescent, it made, you look at the zebra would be some neurological, neurodevelopmental issue. She was diagnosed apparently as a child with ADHD, but is there something else going on with her in her brain that could possibly help to explain her very, very aberrant behaviors? And I've seen by now probably thousands of people with mental illnesses, including the really bad mental illnesses at Mendota. And things just don't totally add up with her. Or just to say, just the kind of the horse diagnoses, the bipolar or some schizophrenia, there seems to be, when you look at her whole history and the way she's presenting now, there seems to be something else there. So I would recommend at this point, I don't know how it can be done unless it's inpatient, a thorough neuropsychological evaluation.
Did you consider recommending an MRI of her brain as well as part of the testing?
Yeah, I'm not a medical doctor, so that has to be done by a psychiatrist or a neurologist, but they are a board-certified psychiatrist who's also a board-certified neurologist and simultaneous. So that would have to be recommended by a psychiatrist. Usually after neuropsychological evaluation and testing is done. It's usually the order it's done. I did mention to you, Mr. Freilich, that if we're able to get her childhood and adolescent inpatient records, you've asked for the Bellin child adolescent psychiatry inpatient records from when she was in 11th grade, but there's also, she has reported earlier that she was admitted to a psychiatric facility when she was in 7th grade. If we can get those records, which I hope we can soon, then she may have had those screening tests when she was younger. We just don't know. But at this point in time, I would recommend thorough neuropsychological testing as a first step. And then her psychiatrist would have to take it from there, whether or not he would recommend an MRI just to make sure there's not some kind of a developmental disorder, neurodevelopmental disorder that could possibly account for some of her odd presentations. So that's what I would strongly recommend at this point.
Go ahead.
The other issue, I keep going here a bit, is this is also beyond a very interesting, very, very complex case that I recognize from day one. But the other interesting and real confusing aspect of this case is that now we have this woman who's been evaluated, I don't know, is it 4 or 5 by 4 or 5 other evaluators, and she was evaluated yesterday morning by Dr. Seipel, again, for his second time. That there's some very unusual things, well, sort of unusual, about her psychological testing that these other evaluators have done that seem to point to possible feigning or faking, malingering, faking of, intentional faking of a mental illness. I don't think so. I don't think that's what we got going on here. Nope. But the fact that they have said that and that they found that, and so 2 of the evaluators in the past, Dr. Lucetta and one other evaluator, and the judge read from one of their evaluations, 2 of them have suggested that in case her manners, her emotions, her presentation changes regarding competency, that they both suggested that further testing or further evaluation should be done. Well, definitely, I agree with that. Definitely. But the fact that she overpresented symptoms of a mental disorder, and I got this interesting quote from Dr. Lucetta's evaluation for competency, where she could not come up with an opinion. Very unusual for Dr. Lucetta, who, like me, worked inpatient. She was the director of psychology at Winnebago Mental Health. So both she and I have seen hundreds of mentally ill people. Her report is April 29th, 2022. She says that, and this is interesting, the use of screening measures, and that was psychological tests, and this is on page 7. The use of a screening measure is routine, and the possibility that the defendant is feigning is not to be confused with the probability of feigning. Indeed, most defendants classified as possibly faking, as possibly feigning by the screening instrument used in this examination are, on further examination, classified as non-feigning. So, there you go. That even though on psychological tests, personality tests, that Ms. Schabusiness was given by other evaluators that suggested that she was possibly faking mental health symptoms, as Dr. Lucetta astutely pointed out, more often than not, with further evaluations of the person possibly faking, they're not found to be faking. So I definitely agree with that the psychological testings, they're suggestive. But the bottom line is that the fact that she has had numerous evaluators administer psychological testing that indicated she was faking, exaggerating symptoms, that's unusual.
Ms. Schabusiness has been evaluated by multiple doctors, multiple professionals, correct?
Yes, both for the current case and then by many other mental health, both inpatient treaters in the past.
And at least with regards to this case, have you reviewed the other doctors' reports?
Yes.
Did any red flags come out and present themselves to you with regards to your overall review of all these evaluations?
Yeah, there was a lot of red flags, and some of them I've already mentioned. Again, this a red flag is when a person is given a, psychological testing and there is some evidence of feigning, exaggerating symptoms, that's a red flag. In other words, it doesn't mean they're wrong.
Is it a red flag that doctors have different opinions?
Yes. And then the striking Dr. Lucetta's evaluation where she could not form an opinion and recommended inpatient evaluation. It is pretty darn unusual when a psychologist with her experience ends up not being able to make an opinion and then recommends inpatient treatment and evaluation. That was a red flag. The very weird manner how Ms. Schabusiness presents herself, and all of these other prior evaluations, 4 or 5 of them, those were all done before she threw the chair at me and before she attacked her attorney in court. So, that's a bit, subsequent to their evaluations, I was able to experience that. First time in 32 years anybody's thrown a chair at me, okay? And I'm not the government's expert, I'm the defense. Never had that happen before, okay? I'm trying to dredge up thousands of interviews I've done. Did anybody ever refuse to speak with me? Well, yeah, real recently a guy down in Illinois refused to speak with me and as sexually violent person. But that's very unusual where, unless we, say when I worked at Mendota or had gone back to Mendota or Winnebago, I had a guy, guardianship evaluation at Winnebago who refused just a couple days ago, who refused to talk to me. That's very unusual when a person refuses to talk to, not in the guy at Winnebago just the other day, because I'm working for the Allegheny County Court Counsel, but very unusual that a person who's hired for the defense, when they would refuse to speak with me. It was very striking after my 2-hour interview with her when I compared her answers to my questions about competency, about her mental health background. Very striking when I compared her answers to what she had told Dr. Lucetta. Very similar, this off-track, tangential stuff. Dr. Lucetta noticed her thought, and she believed that she had a thought disorder, which I totally agree with. Dr. Lucetta had noticed that, is going off on tangents, saying really strange things. So that those things were quite red flags. The fact how she presented to other evaluators in this case, and then back to other previous mental health treaters, inpatient, the hypersexuality, which nobody else has noticed or considered. I spoke with that about bipolar symptoms when I interviewed her. I asked her point blank about, has she ever experienced hypersexuality? When she was in a very elevated mood, she seemed very surprised about that, and then said yes. That has been a problem. Another little thing that nobody else has noticed was that she continued to be hypersexual. I believe it was when she was admitted to Nicolay. They caught her before she was on antipsychotic medication. She was caught in the bathroom, inpatient. She was caught in a bathroom with 2 different male patients there. So she confirmed hypersexuality behaviors in the past. So that was really striking too.
You talked to her about her drug use, correct?
I believe so. I'd have to look at I believe we covered that. And it's been covered in pretty detail with the other evaluators. and in her past admissions to inpatient treatment. And she's been pretty consistent with and forthright about her drug abuse. Yeah, she admitted to working as a prostitute in 2020 in exchange for methamphetamine. She told me that around that time, she snorted much cocaine and then had impulses that, quote, drive me insane, could not understand, hard to deal with, act out. She described a feeling like floating in the air when she used methamphetamine.
Did you consider whether or not her drug usage may have caused brain damage?
Unfortunately, it is something, and again, that's one of those zebra things that most people who use illegal drugs don't end up with brain damage. However, one of the first drugs she ever used as a child and early adolescence was marijuana, which we know in a subset of kids who use marijuana as a kid or teenager, it can be associated with triggering a psychotic mental illness like bipolar or schizophrenia. And we don't know why exactly, but that's possible. So that's one thing that possibly happens here. A person who has maybe a genetic predisposition to a psychotic mental illness, who then uses marijuana during the time their brain is developing, it is associated with somewhat more likelihood to develop a psychotic mental illness. So that's a possibility there. But then just the whole complex of this case, the complexity of this case, just strongly suggests we need an inpatient. This is a person, in my opinion, has fallen through the cracks, which I don't like to see, from a mentally ill person with a documented mental health history of serious psychotic mental illness. It possibly has fallen through the cracks into the legal system, which is not good. The criminal justice system.
Did you?
Is it methamphetamine? That's another concern I had, or issue. Methamphetamine use, heavy use of drugs like methamphetamine, that can cause, and again, a zebra thing here, very unusual, but that can cause brain damage too. But again, we're now a year beyond any use of methamphetamine or other drugs, and we still have those symptoms. Poor memory, poor concentration, auditory, visual hallucinations, tangential thinking, a thought disorder. So what is it? Is it just bipolar or some schizophrenia? But it just all doesn't quite add up.
Dr. Lighton, did you prepare a report for this case for Taylor Denise Schabusiness?
Yes.
Was that dated July 3rd of 2023?
Yes.
Was that on your letterhead?
Yes.
And where is your office located?
Oshkosh.
Oshkosh, Wisconsin?
Yes.
Dr. Lighton, is your report, 9 pages?
Yes,
Did you sign it?
electronically,
Okay. And it is dated July 3rd of 2023?
yes,
I put a sticker on it, exhibit number 2. You believe that all of the commentary that you provided today is part of your report
yes,
for exhibit number 2?
Any objection?
No.
2 will be received.
Is your testimony to a reasonable degree of psychological certainty?
yes,
And do you have an opinion as it relates to the issue of competency for Taylor Denise Schabusiness?
yes.
What is your opinion?
My opinion in this case is that she's not competent to proceed to trial. Basically, on the basis is that she lacks insight and judgment and the mental capacity to understand the proceedings and to assist in her own defense.
Your Honor, I'd offer exhibit number 2 and number 1.
I already received them both.
Okay, thank you. Nothing further from me.
Cross-examination.
Doctor, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
All right. So you've been retained by the defense in this case, right?
yes,
Is it fair to say the majority of your work is done in 980 work?
no.
Okay. So for instance,
With many guardianships for Allegheny County and a variety of other evaluations. So probably not, maybe half and half, maybe.
okay. So with respect to the publications and presentations you've listed in Exhibit 1 here, it looks like all of them since at least 2010, 2009 are in the area of sexual predators and 980 work. Does that seem accurate?
Well, superficially, because of it's just an example, a very interesting example, where, and again, we're talking about sexually violent person predator evaluations. It's just a thing I stumbled into that field back when we got our law in Chapter 980 law in 1994, and I was working at Mendota, and we all had to do those evaluations. Then right away, controversies started up about how do you do those evaluations, and the controversies just continued. So it's only an example. It's a tiny, tiny little field within the legal matters, the SVP, but it's just an example, convenient for a scientist.
Okay.
Again, to use it to further advance science. So it's like an example of a very controversial area where science is totally derailed. So it's just, I used it as an example, and my main colleague, and we have a whole bunch of international allies helping us on the research too. So we just use it as an example of the controversies for education, to advance science in the legal and mental health field.
So again, the question was, the publications that are listed in Exhibit 1 here deal with sexual violent predator commitments. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. Is there publications recently in the issues of like competency or conducting NGI evaluations?
No.
When you've testified in your capacity in 980 work, have you ever testified for the state as to those findings?
Yes.
And you said hundreds of NGI evaluations, competency evaluations, guardianships, and sentencing-related evaluations. Does that sound right?
Yes.
Of those hundreds, how many of those specifically dealt with competency evaluations?
Every forensic evaluation I do, and that's all I do now, every one, I evaluate the person's competency to proceed to trial. Now, in setting aside the SVP, sexually violent predator or person, and in federal courts, it's the Adam Walsh Act, and I testified in those, and I'm directly appointed.
Doctor, if you could just try to focus on the question, okay? Because I understand you have ranges of experience, but we're not in federal court, so we're not dealing with the Adam Walsh Act or anything of that nature. Just try to focus on the question, okay?
So, Doctor, I'll ask it, how many court-ordered competency evaluations have you performed in your career?
I don't know, I had to count them on my, I don't know.
Okay.
Many.
Many? Are we talking a dozen?
I did 42 while I was at Monona Mental Health Institute. I've done hundreds of evaluations for competency since 1997.
Okay. And those are hundreds of court-ordered competency evaluations since 1997?
Some of them were court-ordered MGIs, some were court-ordered, or not court-ordered, but some were for the defense attorneys for sentencing disposition.
Okay. So then I want to ask about your evaluation with Ms. Schabusiness, and that was June 19th of 2023, right?
Yes.
The interview that formed the basis of your current report, I should say. You previously interviewed her in February, right?
Right.
Okay. Sure. So on June 19th, during your interview with Ms. Schabusiness, did you ask her about various roles of the judicial actors during a criminal case?
Yes.
For instance, did you ask her what the judge's role was in the case?
Yes.
And she replied that it's to judge her, to look at her, things to that effect, right?
Right.
And you went through the jury's role with her.
Right.
And you went through the various pleas that were available to her.
Yeah.
And did you ever talk about, like, did she have an awareness of what she was charged with?
Yes, and she does, both with me in my interview and then with other evaluations. She does know what she's charged with.
And not only, what she's charged with, but like the substance of the allegations. Did she appear to have an understanding of that too?
You mean the substance, you mean the severity of it, Matt?
Yeah, what the state alleges happened. Is she aware of that?
Yeah, we did not go into big, major detail about the case events, but she seems to be aware of she knows what she's charged with. That's consistent throughout my interview and the prior interview. She knows what she's charged with. She seems to, not in my interview, but other people's interviews, she seems to recognize the seriousness, misdemeanor versus a felony.
And Attorney Freilich was with Ms. Schabusiness during your contact with her on June 19th, right?
Yes.
Did she have an awareness of who that person was?
Yes.
And there were times I think he talked about where they would confer and Attorney Freilich would talk to her about certain things that we were talking about?
Only when I invited him to do that. He remained silent for most of, other than the initial interview to set her at ease. And she seemed responsive to that. But other than that, he didn't interject anything.
Sure.
Other than when I asked him to explain to her appropriate courtroom behaviors.
And I think I may have asked this, you kind of touched on the various plea options, not guilty, NGI pleas with the defendant.
Yeah.
Did you talk through like what those various things mean in terms of what the consequences of various pleas are?
To some extent. Again, she had an increasing problem with being very distracted, inattentive. And I was a little surprised during just the plea options that she still seemed pretty hazy about them, even though she had been explained them before. With say the NGI plea, she didn't seem to understand what happened if you're found NGI. But I explained the bifurcated trial, and she appeared familiar with it.
To
some extent, but again, I had to explain it all to her again, which is unusual because she had that explained to her by, 3 other evaluators.
When you explained those topics and concepts to the defendant, did you then ask, to see if she had the capacity to retain that information?
No.
You didn't ask that?
So, at that point, I mean, during the whole interview, she was distracted, and by that point in the interview, she was very distracted by apparent auditory hallucinations, visual stuff. So I didn't go back in each of those areas to see if she retained the information.
And again, this interview was June 19th, right?
Right.
So you were aware about 6 days before your interview with Ms. Schabusiness, there was a day-long motion hearing. Were you aware of that?
I'm not sure. There's been numerous motion hearings that I wasn't aware of, so I'm not sure.
Did you ever inquire with the defendant if, hey, did you know what happened last week? Were you aware of that hearing? Did you ever ask any of those questions?
I asked her the questions about the chair throwing, with me, which she didn't have any memory for. I asked her about the attack on her, Mr. Jolly in the courtroom.
I think the question, Doctor, was related to the hearing that occurred a few days. I don't think he asked whether you asked her about the chair. So just try to focus on the question, Doctor. Mr. Fralick can certainly ask redirect questions, okay? Why don't you go ahead and ask the question again, Mr. Saunders?
Yeah, so was there any conversation with the defendant about her awareness of what happened on June 13th at that hearing?
I don't believe I asked her about that. I didn't know what it was. You'd have to remind me what that was.
Okay, so there was no discussion about any prior hearings. Was she aware of what was going on? There were hearings in May, there were hearings in April. Any discussion about those hearings?
Not unless one of them involved a chair, her attacking Mr. Jolly.
Okay. You brought up the topic of prior evaluators talking about the topic of feigning, malingering. Do you remember talking about that earlier in direct examination?
Yeah.
And I think in your report, you actually quote, psychological testing by other evaluators found signs of possible malingering or intentional faking of mental disorder symptoms. Does that seem consistent with what you wrote in your report?
Yeah.
And, with somebody with your experience, is that something you're trained to kind of look for in every evaluation you're doing?
Yeah.
Sometimes you use, instruments to kind of gauge that.
Yeah.
And I think you even referenced at the end of your report, quote, testing can reveal attempts to fake a mental disorder, end quote. Is that right?
Yes.
And so what attempts and instruments did you use in this case to determine if the information Ms. Schabusiness was telling you was feigned or a false narrative?
I did not do any formal psychological testing with Ms. Schabusiness.
And I think you did mention on direct that sometimes those screening measures can be utilized to help with that, right?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes.
And there's none that you utilized in this case.
No.
Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing further.
On those topics, Mr. Fralick.
Based on your training and experience in meeting with lots of different patients, sometimes do you come into a situation where someone that you're assessing or evaluating, they try to fool you into thinking they're normal?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Yes, that happens to kind of the reverse. Yeah, right.
Is that where feigning or faking can come in?
Well, yes, but when that's used kind of formally, it means the person's intending to intentionally faking mental health symptoms. I think what you asked was kind of the reverse. Do sometimes people I'm evaluating, try to convince me they don't have a mental illness? Well, that happens a lot. And Ms. Schabusiness has done that with other evaluators or treaters, that she doesn't have a mental illness.
when the prosecutor was asking you questions about whether Ms. Schabusiness talked about motion hearings or other court proceedings, and you started talking about throwing a chair and the attack on Mr. Jolly, what were you referring to?
I don't remember what the hearing was that she threw the chair, or rather, when she attacked Mr. Jolly, I think that was for a competency motion, but I guess there's been 5 competency hearings so far in this case, and I don't remember which is which and what all motions were done with each of those hearings.
Did she ever give you any reasons why she threw the chair or apparently attacked Mr. Jolly?
No, well, with the chair throwing with me, she didn't recall it. She said she only read it in the jail logbook, but she just, and then when I asked her about why did she attack Mr. Jolly, which was unusual. I mean, not only was that unusual to do that in court, but it was unusual because she had previously expressed that she liked him, so that was unusual. And the only thing she said was about that, you know, I asked her, what were your thoughts at the time she attacked Mr. Jolly in court? And she could only say it was like a carnival in the courtroom. She told Mr. Jolly in the past that she had a very hard time thinking. That was the only reason she gave Mr. Jolly about why she threw the chair at me. I had problems with thinking.
And during your meetings with her, did she exhibit any obsessive compulsive behaviors as well?
I think this is outside the scope. I'd object, Judge.
Yeah, Mr. Freilich, you're covering issues that he didn't cover in his cross. So you're getting back into direct. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
Okay, I have nothing further then.
Okay, any on those topics, Mr.
No, thank you.
Saunders?
Sorry.
Okay.
Your Honor, on that topic though, would the court at least consider some of the comments in her report related to obsessive compulsive issues?
The report's been offered into evidence and it's been received, so I consider everything that's in evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the matter is concluded for today then, Doctor. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we break for the day, there's just a couple of topics I wanted to address. Have the attorneys had an opportunity now to review the jury questionnaires and converse about perhaps individuals that you're looking to have stricken and reached agreements or disagreements on those? I'll start with the state.
I think counsel had a lengthy hearing yesterday afternoon when we were going to meet. I'm available today. We hadn't talked about that, but perhaps today. I fully reviewed it, and I think we can agree on some strikes.
Your Honor, I've reviewed the jury questionnaires, and my plan would be to talk with Mr. Saunders if he has time this morning. I wasn't able to meet with him yesterday because of a lengthy hearing in the afternoon.
Okay, well, because the next topic I wanted to discover or to address with the parties is whether we actually need to have a pretrial conference, which is scheduled for Monday morning, because we've met and we are going to continue to meet before this trial starts. And so just reassembling for no particular purpose is something I want to avoid as much as I can. On the other hand, I don't know if that's something that either the attorneys are prepared to weigh in on. Mr. Saunders?
I can't think of a reason to keep it on at this point, so I don't have an objection to that.
Mr. Freilich?
Your Honor, I don't think we need to meet next week on Monday at 8:30, but that's up to the court.
Well, here's the thing. When I scan my mind for things that need to be addressed, the only thing I can think of is the jury questionnaires. It's really the only thing I could think that we would need a pretrial conference to address, because we've addressed all sorts of motions in limine, and everything we usually do at a pretrial conference has already been done. In addition, we're meeting again before the trial starts on Friday morning. So My inclination at this point is to take the pretrial conference off because I don't see that it's needed. And I'm not sure that there's anything that we can't take up on Friday that we need to take up on Monday. So that's what I'm going to do. The pretrial is coming off. We're still on for 8:30 in the morning on Friday. To the extent the attorneys can agree on a list of the jurors that they both believe perhaps ought not to be called in, that would be great. If there's certain ones that perhaps one side believes ought not to be invited in and ought to be stricken, and the other side doesn't, I can take that up on Friday morning. Okay?
Okay.
Anything else for the record today, Mr. Saunders?
No.
Mr. Freilich, anything else?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Matters concluded then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. See you soon.